Artillerymen compel people to take them seriously. They flocked round Gavroche. But he had no time to tell anything. Marius drew him aside with a shudder. "What are you doing here?" "Hello," said the child, "what are you doing here yourself?" And he stared at Marius intently with his epic effrontery. His eyes grew larger with the proud light within them. It was with an accent of severity that Marius continued. "Who told you to come back? Did you deliver my letter at the address?" Gavroche was not without some compunctions in the matter of that letter. In his haste to return to the barricade, he had got rid of it rather than delivered it. He was forced to acknowledge to himself that he had confided it rather lightly to that stranger whose face he had not been able to make out. It is true that the man was bareheaded, but that was not sufficient. In short, he had been administering to himself little inward remonstrances and he feared Marius' reproaches. In order to extricate himself from the predicament, he took the simplest course. He lied abominably. "Citizen, I delivered the letter to the porter. The lady was asleep. She will have the letter when she wakes up." Marius had had two objects in sending that letter: to bid farewell to Cosette and to save Gavroche. He was obliged to content himself with the half of his desire. The dispatch of his letter and the presence of M. Fauchelevent in the barricade, was a coincidence which occurred to him. He pointed out M. Fauchelevent to Gavroche. "Do you know that man?" "No," said Gavroche. Gavroche had, in fact, as we have just mentioned, seen Jean Valjean only at night. The troubled and unhealthy conjectures which had outlined themselves in Marius' mind were dissipated. Did he know M. Fauchelevent's opinions? Perhaps M. Fauchelevent was a Republican. Hence his very natural presence in this combat. In the meanwhile, Gavroche was shouting, at the other end of the barricade. "My gun!" Courfeyrac had it returned to him. Gavroche warned his comrades, as he called them, that the barricade was blocked. He had had great difficulty in reaching it. A battalion of the line whose arms were piled in the Rue de la Petite Truanderie was on the watch on the side of the Rue du Cygne. On the opposite side, the municipal guard occupied the Rue des Prêcheurs. The bulk of the army was facing them in front. This information given, Gavroche added, "I authorize you to hit him a tremendous whack." Meanwhile, Enjolras was straining his ears and watching at his embrasure. The assailants, dissatisfied, no doubt, with their shot, had not repeated it. A company of infantry of the line had come up and occupied the end of the street behind the piece of ordnance. The soldiers were tearing up the pavement and constructing with the stones a small, low wall, a sort of side work not more than 18 inches high, and facing the barricade. In the angle at the left of this epaulement, there was visible the head of the column of a battalion from the suburbs massed in the Rue Saint-Denis. Enjolras, on the watch, thought he distinguished the peculiar sound which is produced when the shells of grape shot are drawn from the caissons. And he saw the commander of the piece change the elevation and incline the mouth of the cannon slightly to the left. Then the canonneurs began to load the piece. The chief seized the lint-stock himself and lowered it to the vent. "Down with your heads, hug the wall!" shouted Enjolras, "and all on your knees along the barricade." The insurgents who were straggling in front of the wine shop, and who had quitted their posts of combat on Gavroche's arrival, rushed pell-mell towards the barricade. But before Enjolras' order could be executed, the discharge took place with the terrifying rattle of a round of grape shot. This is what it was, in fact. The charge had been aimed at the cut in the redoubt, and had there rebounded from the wall. And this terrible rebound had produced 2 dead and 3 wounded. If this were continued, the barricade was no longer tenable. The grape shot made its way in. A murmur of consternation arose. "Let us prevent the second discharge," said Enjolras. And, lowering his rifle, he took aim at the captain of the gun, who, at that moment, was bearing down on the breech of his gun and rectifying and definitely fixing its pointing. The captain of the piece was a handsome sergeant of artillery. Very young, blonde, with a very gentle face, and the intelligent air peculiar to that predestined and redoubtable weapon which, by dint of perfecting itself in horror, must end in killing war. Combeferre, who was standing beside Enjolras, scrutinized this young man. "What a pity," said Combeferre. "What hideous things these butcheries are. Come, when there are no more kings, there will be no more war. Enjolras, you are taking aim at that sergeant, you are not looking at him. Fancy, he is a charming young man. He is intrepid. It is evident that he is thoughtful. Those young artillerymen are very well educated. He has a father, a mother, a family. He is probably in love. He is not more than 25 at the most. He might be your brother." "He is," said Enjolras. "Yes," replied Combeferre, "he is mine too." "Well, let us not kill him. Let me alone. It must be done." And a tear trickled slowly down Enjolras' marble cheek. At the same moment, he pressed the trigger of his rifle. The flame leaped forth. The artilleryman turned round twice, his arms extended in front of him, his head uplifted, as though for breath, then he fell with his side on the gun, and lay there motionless. They could see his back, from the center of which there flowed directly a stream of blood. The ball had traversed his breast from side to side. He was dead. He had to be carried away and replaced by another. Several minutes were thus gained, in fact. Chapter 9. Employment of the old talents of a poacher and that infallible marksmanship which influenced the condemnation of 1796. Opinions were exchanged in the barricade. The firing from the gun was about to begin again. Against that grape shot, they could not hold out a quarter of an hour longer. It was absolutely necessary to deaden the blows. Enjolras issued this command. "We must place a mattress there." "We have none," said Combeferre, "the wounded are lying on them." Jean Valjean, who was seated apart on a stone post, at the corner of the tavern, with his gun between his knees, had, up to that moment, taken no part in anything that was going on. He did not appear to hear the combatants saying around him, "Here is a gun that is doing nothing." At the order issued by Enjolras, he rose. It will be remembered that, on the arrival of the rabble in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, an old woman, foreseeing the bullets, had placed her mattress in front of her window. This window, an attic window, was on the roof of a 6-story house situated a little beyond the barricade. The mattress, placed crosswise, supported at the bottom on 2 poles for drying linen, was upheld at the top by 2 ropes, which, at that distance, looked like 2 threads, and which were attached to 2 nails planted in the window frames. These ropes were distinctly visible, like hairs, against the sky. "Can someone lend me a double-barreled rifle?" said Jean Valjean. Enjolras, who had just reloaded his, handed it to him. Jean Valjean took aim at the attic window and fired. One of the mattress ropes was cut. The mattress now hung by 1 thread only. Jean Valjean fired the second charge. The second rope lashed the panes of the attic window. The mattress slipped between the 2 poles and fell into the street. The barricade applauded. All voices cried, "Here is a mattress." "Yes," said Combeferre, "but who will go and fetch it?" The mattress had, in fact, fallen outside the barricade, between besiegers and besieged. Now, the death of the sergeant of artillery having exasperated the troop, the soldiers had, for several minutes, been lying flat on their stomachs behind the line of paving stones which they had erected. And, in order to supply the forced silence of the piece, which was quiet while its service was in course of reorganization, they had opened fire on the barricade. The insurgents did not reply to this musketry, in order to spare their ammunition. The fusillade broke against the barricade. But the street, which it filled, was terrible. Jean Valjean stepped out of the cut, entered the street, traversed the storm of bullets, walked up to the mattress, hoisted it upon his back, and returned to the barricade. He placed the mattress in the cut with his own hands. He fixed it there against the wall in such a manner that the artillerymen should not see it. That done, they awaited the next discharge of grape shot. It was not long in coming. The cannon vomited forth its package of buckshot with a roar. But there was no rebound. The effect which they had foreseen had been attained. The barricade was saved. "Citizen," said Enjolras to Jean Valjean, "the Republic thanks you." Bossuet admired and laughed. He exclaimed, "It is immoral that a mattress should have so much power. Triumph of that which yields over that which strikes with lightning. But never mind, glory to the mattress which annuls a cannon." Chapter 10. Dawn. At that moment, Cosette awoke. Her chamber was narrow, neat, unobtrusive, with a long sash window, facing the east on the back courtyard of the house. Cosette knew nothing of what was going on in Paris. She had not been there on the preceding evening, and she had already retired to her chamber when Toussaint had said, "It appears that there is a row." Cosette had slept only a few hours, but soundly. She had had sweet dreams, which possibly arose from the fact that her little bed was very white. Someone, who was Marius, had appeared to her in the light. She awoke with the sun in her eyes, which, at first, produced on her the effect of being a continuation of her dream. Her first thought on emerging from this dream was a smiling one. Cosette felt herself thoroughly reassured. Like Jean Valjean, she had, a few hours previously, passed through that reaction of the soul which absolutely will not hear of unhappiness. She began to cherish hope, with all her might, without knowing why. Then she felt a pang at her heart. It was 3 days since she had seen Marius. But she said to herself that he must have received her letter, that he knew where she was, and that he was so clever that he would find means of reaching her. And that certainly today, and perhaps that very morning. It was broad daylight, but the rays of light were very horizontal. She thought that it was very early, but that she must rise, nevertheless, in order to receive Marius. She felt that she could not live without Marius, and that, consequently, that was sufficient and that Marius would come. No objection was valid. All this was certain. It was monstrous enough already to have suffered for 3 days. Marius absent 3 days, this was horrible on the part of the good God. Now, this cruel teasing from on high had been gone through with. Marius was about to arrive, and he would bring good news. Youth is made thus. It quickly dries its eyes. It finds sorrow useless and does not accept it. Youth is the smile of the future in the presence of an unknown quantity, which is itself. It is natural to it to be happy. It seems as though its respiration were made of hope. Moreover, Cosette could not remember what Marius had said to her on the subject of this absence which was to last only 1 day, and what explanation of it he had given her. Every one has noticed with what nimbleness a coin which one has dropped on the ground rolls away and hides, and with what art it renders itself undiscoverable. There are thoughts which play us the same trick. They nestle away in a corner of our brain. That is the end of them. They are lost. It is impossible to lay the memory on them. Cosette was somewhat vexed at the useless little effort made by her memory. She told herself, that it was very naughty and very wicked of her, to have forgotten the words uttered by Marius. She sprang out of bed and accomplished the 2 ablutions of soul and body, her prayers and her toilet. One may, in a case of exigency, introduce the reader into a nuptial chamber, not into a virginal chamber. Verse would hardly venture it, prose must not. It is the interior of a flower that is not yet unfolded. It is whiteness in the dark, it is the private cell of a closed lily, which must not be gazed upon by man so long as the sun has not gazed upon it. Woman in the bud is sacred. That innocent bud which opens. That adorable half-nudity which is afraid of itself. That white foot which takes refuge in a slipper. That throat which veils itself before a mirror as though a mirror were an eye. That chemise which makes haste to rise up and conceal the shoulder for a creaking bit of furniture or a passing vehicle. Those cords tied. Those clasps fastened. Those laces drawn. Those tremors. Those shivers of cold and modesty. That exquisite affright in every movement. That almost winged uneasiness where there is no cause for alarm. The successive phases of dressing, as charming as the clouds of dawn, it is not fitting that all this should be narrated, and it is too much to have even called attention to it. The eye of man must be more religious in the presence of the rising of a young girl than in the presence of the rising of a star. The possibility of hurting should inspire an augmentation of respect. The down on the peach. The bloom on the plum, the radiated crystal of the snow, the wing of the butterfly powdered with feathers, are coarse compared to that chastity which does not even know that it is chaste. The young girl is only the flash of a dream, and is not yet a statue. Her bedchamber is hidden in the somber part of the ideal. The indiscreet touch of a glance brutalizes this vague penumbra. Here, contemplation is profanation. We shall, therefore, show nothing of that sweet little flutter of Cosette's rising. An Oriental tale relates how the rose was made white by God, but that Adam looked upon her when she was unfolding, and she was ashamed and turned crimson. We are of the number who fall speechless in the presence of young girls and flowers, since we think them worthy of veneration. Cosette dressed herself very hastily. Combed and dressed her hair, which was a very simple matter in those days, when women did not swell out their curls and bands with cushions and puffs, and did not put crinoline in their locks. Then she opened the window and cast her eyes around her in every direction, hoping to descry some bit of the street, an angle of the house, an edge of pavement, so that she might be able to watch for Marius there. But no view of the outside was to be had. The back court was surrounded by tolerably high walls, and the outlook was only on several gardens. Cosette pronounced these gardens hideous. For the first time in her life, she found flowers ugly. The smallest scrap of the gutter of the street would have met her wishes better. She decided to gaze at the sky, as though she thought that Marius might come from that quarter. All at once, she burst into tears. Not that this was fickleness of soul, but hopes cut in twain by dejection, that was her case. She had a confused consciousness of something horrible. Thoughts were rife in the air, in fact. She told herself that she was not sure of anything, that to withdraw herself from sight was to be lost. And the idea that Marius could return to her from heaven appeared to her no longer charming but mournful. Then, as is the nature of these clouds, calm returned to her, and hope and a sort of unconscious smile, which yet indicated trust in God. Every one in the house was still asleep. A country-like silence reigned. Not a shutter had been opened. The porter's lodge was closed. Toussaint had not risen, and Cosette, naturally, thought that her father was asleep. She must have suffered much, and she must have still been suffering greatly, for she said to herself, that her father had been unkind. But she counted on Marius. The eclipse of such a light was decidedly impossible. Now and then, she heard sharp shocks in the distance, and she said, "It is odd that people should be opening and shutting their carriage gates so early." They were the reports of the cannon battering the barricade. A few feet below Cosette's window, in the ancient and perfectly black cornice of the wall, there was a martin's nest. The curve of this nest formed a little projection beyond the cornice, so that from above it was possible to look into this little paradise. The mother was there, spreading her wings like a fan over her brood. The father fluttered about, flew away, then came back, bearing in his beak food and kisses. The dawning day gilded this happy thing, the great law, multiply, lay there smiling and august, and that sweet mystery unfolded in the glory of the morning. Cosette, with her hair in the sunlight, her soul absorbed in chimeras, illuminated by love within and by the dawn without, bent over mechanically, and almost without daring to avow to herself that she was thinking at the same time of Marius, began to gaze at these birds, at this family, at that male and female, that mother and her little ones, with the profound trouble which a nest produces on a virgin.